Clara Finch had always believed her shop smelled faintly of cinnamon, although no one else seemed able to detect it. The snug warren of rooms that formed Finch's folios nestled in a narrow Bloomsbury mews, half hidden behind rambling ivy and a hanging sign painted with a sleepy barn owl. The days were measured by the slow tick of a grandfather clock and the hush of turning pages. It was October, the lanes slick with recent rain, and Clara was nursing a cup of builder's tea when the telephone rang. The caller, an American professor with an accent bright as copper pennies, wanted a first-edition copy of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol for the university's bicentennial exhibit. Clara had one, or so she believed, somewhere in the muddled depths of her back storerooms. She promised the professor she would confirm within the week, then knotted her grey-streaked hair, fetched a torch, and ventured into the gloom. Beyond the public rooms lay a corridor of mismatched crates, dust sheets, and forgotten reading chairs. The small rear annex, once the kitchen of a Georgian townhouse, had been shuttered for years. A builder, long since retired, had warned her that the walls were peculiar. Clara, accustomed to quirks, simply used the space for overflow stock. Now she pushed aside a teetering tower of magazines and discovered an unfamiliar outline along the northern wall. A bookcase, higher than it was wide, seemed slightly misaligned. She pressed her fingers along the moulding. The wood flexed, hinged rather than nailed. A false shelf, she realized, heart quickening. Perhaps an enterprising smuggler had carved a secret cupboard for contraband pamphlets. Antiquarian books often hid their own dramas, but the hush in that annex felt weightier than pages. She thumbed the concealed latch, and the shelf swung outward on silent brass pivots. The smell struck her first, not rot exactly, but the stale, papery odour of old textiles sealed away from air. Behind the shelf sat a recess large enough for two people to stand shoulder to shoulder. And there, slumped against the brickwork, was a man. His suit, pinstriped and narrow-lapelled, belonged to another decade, yet the fabric retained a ghost of elegance. Time had thinned his hair to silver wires. Horn-rimmed spectacles clung to a brittle ear. Clara froze, the torchbeam trembling across the hollow of his cheeks. She had read enough Christie to know that one didn't jostle corpses. Instead, she backed away, replaced the shelf with trembling hands, and dialed 9999 from the wall phone next to the teapot. Detective Inspector Henry Bascom arrived in a Barber jacket that smelled faintly of Labrador. He treated the bookshop with a reverence usually reserved for cathedrals, gliding between stacks as if afraid to bend the spines with his shadow. A constable photographed the hidden alcove, while a forensic pathologist, tiny and precise, took samples. Bascom turned to Clara with kindly curiosity. "You've never opened that shelf before." She shook her head. "I didn't know it existed. I only meant to find a first edition." He lifted an eyebrow. "Well, you've certainly found something." Preliminary estimates placed the time of death in the late 1970s. No fingerprints, but the victims lingered. Dust suggested decades of undisturbed stillness. Clara wrapped her cardigan tighter. In that moment, the shop felt less like cinnamon and more like an uncut London fog. Word rippled through the neighbourhood faster than an Oxford comma. Regulars came bearing sympathy scones and theories. Some were convinced the body belonged to a German spy. Others insisted on a jealous spouse. Clara, however, was more pragmatic than fanciful. She retrieved the shop's ownership documents, which stretched back 2 centuries. In 1974, Finch's folios had been sold to a man named Mortimer Blackwell. a reclusive dealer with a reputation for both scholarship and debt. Blackwell sold the shop again in 1981, and Clara purchased it from that interim owner a decade later. Of Blackwell's fate, the records said nothing. Still, the corpse's suit looked 1970s sharp, and the police sketch artist's rendering matched the single newspaper photograph Clara located in an old trade journal. The dead man wasn't Blackwell. He was Alistair Green, Blackwell's junior partner, missing since 1978. Inspector Bascom kept her informed. Green's bank accounts had lain dormant. No living relatives had filed a missing person report, perhaps assuming he'd absconded to America with ill-gotten gains. Bascom admitted, almost sheepishly, that outdated record-keeping meant Green had fallen through administrative cracks. Clara felt a surge of indignation on the dead man's behalf. Someone must have cared about him, she insisted. The inspector agreed, but urged caution. The killer might still be alive, and Clara had already become an accidental witness. She nodded, yet the curiosity that fueled her career tugged insistently at her sleeve. Late one evening, while Bascom sifted property deeds, Clara combed through Blackwell's annotated catalogues, which she'd discovered in a forgotten biscuit tin. Among the meticulous listings of vellum bindings and marbled end papers, one phrase recurred in red pencil. "Carroll, keep off ledger." The cryptic warning appeared beside several Dickens titles sold in the months before Green disappeared. Clara frowned. Why would Blackwell guard a commonplace novel so fiercely? Unless the edition in question wasn't commonplace at all. Dickens's own first issue of A Christmas Carol bore salmon-pink endpapers and staves printed in green and red. Collectors would auction their grandmothers for it. But Clara suspected an even rarer variant, one of the 24 presentation copies Dickens had inscribed for close friends. If such a treasure had passed through the shop, motives for murder multiplied. The next clue arrived in the form of Mrs. Patel, owner of the tea shop 2 doors down, and a self-confessed eavesdropper. Over chai, she recalled that her late husband once delivered crates to Finch's folios in the summer of 1978. Heavy boxes, she reminisced, sealed like Fort Knox. A frail, panicked man, not Blackwell but the younger partner, had supervised the unloading before disappearing inside. Later, Patel's husband spotted Blackwell leaving after midnight, jacket torn and face scratched. Clara scribbled notes. Green had been alive that afternoon, possibly dead by nightfall. But where was the coveted book now? Inspector Bascom allowed Clara to examine the preserved alcove under police supervision. While forensics focused on biological evidence, Clara looked at architecture. The recess, she realized, had originally been a coal chute widened during wartime renovations. Narrow wooden battens held aging packing straw. Something glimmered at her feet, a single brass clasp shaped like a cherub's wing. She recognized it as a Victorian bookbox latch. The box itself was missing, but the clasp's presence suggested someone had hidden a small casket beside Green, perhaps believing it'd be sealed forever. That someone might have returned later to retrieve it, leaving the clasp behind, or the box could still lurk elsewhere in the shop. Clara spent a sleepless night cataloguing every Dickens volume in her inventory. None matched the description of a presentation copy. She was drafting an apologetic email to the American professor when a name fluttered from memory: Rupert Kay. He owned the glossy new antiquarian storefront on Museum Street and had more than once tried to buy Finch's folios for its location potential. Rupert prided himself on unearthing spectacular rarities just in time for international fairs. Gossip claimed Blackwell had mentored him briefly before closing shop in 81. Clara's fingers tightened around her mug. Could Rupert have knowledge, perhaps possession, of the elusive Carol? A rare book auction at the Royal Institute provided the perfect pretext. Bundling herself in tartan wool, Clara mingled among dealers, her badge reading C. Finch, Observer. The lots included medieval manuscripts, modernist firsts, and, buried mid-catalogue, a Charles Dickens 1843 unique provenance. Its description lacked photographs. Clara's pulse stuttered. She lingered near the display case until Rupert appeared, resplendent in an emerald cravat. His expression flickered upon seeing her, then smoothed into oily charm. "Clara, my dear, looking for stocking stuffers?" She chuckled non-committally, but her eyes flicked to the Carol. Rupert followed her gaze, smiled thinly, and excused himself. Clara tracked him to the courtyard where he was pacing, phone pressed to ear. She heard snippets. "Must go through, Bascom tonight." The inspector's name jolted her. Rupert ended the call, turned and offered a brittle smile. "Eavesdropping, Miss Finch." She steadied her voice. "I'm simply admiring the architecture." He held her gaze a moment too long, then strode away. Clara hurried to a payphone, her mobile battery inconveniently dead, and left a message for Bascom. "I think the murderer is about to move the book. Please ring me." The night air smelled of rain and risk. Bascom met her at the shop an hour later, tie askew, bearing 2 cartons of takeaway curry. Clara outlined her theory. Blackwell killed Green, hid both body and book. Years later, facing bankruptcy, he confided in his protégé Rupert, promising shared profit if they could retrieve the treasure. But perhaps Blackwell died before revealing the exact location. Rupert, suspecting the book remained somewhere in Finch's folios, had tried to buy the premises. Failing that, he now planned a clandestine search while police interest spiked. Bascom listened, brow furrowed. "It's plausible," he admitted, "but we need evidence." Clara proposed a sting. Rumour, seeded through trade chatter, that the shop would be unguarded while forensic teams decamped for laboratory analysis. Bascom agreed, stationed plainclothes officers in the neighbouring flats, and asked Clara to spend the night at her sister's. Clara naturally refused. Curiosity trumped comfort. She decamped to the mezzanine office, ostensibly to do paperwork, while police melted into shadows. At 2 a.m, floorboards creaked. Clara, gripping a brass candlestick with more courage than sense, peered down through the banister grating. Rupert emerged from the annex, flashlight strobing along shelves. He moved with practiced certainty, pausing at the false bookcase. With a deft flick, he opened it. The alcove now gaped empty, but for chalk outlines where Green had lain. Rupert cursed softly. He probed brick seams, then stepped back, expression twisting. "Where did you put it, old man?" he muttered. Clara realized that he assumed Blackwell, not police, had removed the body. Bascom had predicted this. A floorboard groaned behind Rupert. He spun. Inspector Bascom, flanked by 2 constables, levelled a calm voice. "Looking for something, Mr. Kay?" Rupert attempted bravado. "Inspector, Miss Finch gave me permission to survey structural defects." Clara appeared at the stair, raising an eyebrow. "I did nothing of the sort." Bascom produced a warrant. Officers patted Rupert down, discovering a slim pry bar, gloves, and, tucked inside his jacket, an aged envelope embossed with Blackwell's crest. The earlier phone call had evidently yielded fresh intel. Inside the envelope lay a map of Finch's folios, marked with a red X in the main reading room. Rupert's shoulders sagged. Blackwell kept notes, he confessed. I paid good money for them. That book belongs to me by right of purchase. Bascombe corrected him gently. Stolen property remained stolen, no matter how many hands it passed through. Rupert, recognizing defeat, glared at Clara. You don't even know what you're guarding, he hissed. The inspector escorted Rupert outside, leaving 2 constables on watch. Dawn smeared peach over London. Clara, clutching a shawl, regarded the map. The X sat beneath the big bay window, where children sometimes curled to read adventure tales. Sunlight spilled through at midday, gilding oak floorboards the colour of toffee. Clara fetched a screwdriver, removed the brass vent below the window seat, and peered inside. Nestled among cobwebs lay a mahogany book-shaped box missing its clasp, its twin to the one found near Green. Heart hammering, she lifted it into daylight. The lid creaked open, releasing a puff of cedar. There, cupped in cloth, rested a slim volume bound in crimson morocco, its gilt edges shimmering. On the flyleaf in Dickens's brisk hand gleamed an inscription, "To my valued friend and confidant, J. Forster. May the spirits be ever kind. C.D. 1843. Even Clara, seasoned dealer, felt tears sting her eyes. Inspector Bascombe returned as she cradled the book. He handled it with gloved awe. "Is that?" She nodded. "A presentation copy to John Forster, Dickens's biographer. Only rumours of its existence remained." Bascombe exhaled. "I imagine that's several £1,000,000 of motive." Forensics sealed the volume as evidence, but not before Clara photographed every page, savouring the marbled end-paper swirls like sugared plums. Rupert, faced with burglary, obstruction and conspiracy, provided a statement implicating Blackwell in Green's murder. According to Rupert, Blackwell had confessed one gin-soaked night. He and Green discovered the carol in a deceased collector's attic and smuggled it, planning to sell abroad. Green threatened to alert authorities, fearing legal repercussions. In panic, Blackwell struck him with a brass candlestick, the very one Clara had brandished inadvertently. Realizing the shop's old coal chute could hide shame as well as soot, Blackwell buried both secret and partner, then erected the false shelf. Years later, guilt and desperation loosened his tongue to Rupert, but Blackwell died of heart failure before the stash could be reclaimed. Weeks passed. Autumn leaned into winter, and Finch's folios regained its cinnamon hush. Clara repaired the false shelf, now a harmless curiosity, displaying reprints of Christie and Allingham. The reading nook hosted children's story hours again. Only Clara noticed how sunlight lingered kindly upon the floorboards. The Forster Carol, once evidence, was destined for the British Library after legal formalities. Its insurance value, Clara learned, could keep her shop afloat for decades, though she derived equal satisfaction from the idea that scholars and schoolchildren alike would soon admire its gilt. Inspector Bascombe visited often, sometimes with pastry, ostensibly to update her on court proceedings. They sat by the pot-bellied stove, discussing epigraphs and etymology, until the sky outside pooled with indigo. One crisp December evening, Bascombe arrived bearing a small parcel. Inside lay a replica of Dickens's presentation inscription, painstakingly calligraphed, beneath which the inspector had written, "To Miss Finch, whose curiosity kept Christmas well." H. Clara laughed, cheeks warming brighter than the stove. She slipped the card between the pages of her well-worn shop ledger, the same ledger that had once hidden clues in red ink. Outside, London's lights twinkled across wet cobblestones. Inside, the grandfather clock chimed, the kettle whistled, and the ghosts of past and present stories settled contentedly on their shelves.